When you think about history, are there lots of old guys wearing wigs and stockings? When you think about history, is Napoleon really short? And folks have wooden teeth. Do you know that history can be the most incredible, amazing stories for you and me? Sit back and listen to a story right now. It's honest, it's fun, and it's sure to.
Hi, young historians. Welcome to another episode of Anytime Now. I'm Brooke, co-founder of Honest History. Are you as excited about this episode as I am? I sure hope so. We're about to dive into another story-filled adventure and learn something new. And remember, by learning more about the past, you can make a positive impact on the future. So pack your bags and let's go.
Step right up, boys and girls, and hear a dazzling tale. This is the story of the greatest show on earth. A show filled with death-defying stunts that are sure to make you gasp. That's right, this is the story of the circus. Have you ever wondered how the circus was invented? Well, in this episode, you'll get your answer and learn some incredible history along the way. It's showtime, folks. Get your tickets ready, and let's travel to any time now. Our story begins in 1768. It was a sunny spring day in London, England. A crowd gathered excitedly around a circular track in a large field. As the people waited, they could hear the neigh of horses coming from inside the stables nearby. The crowd had been promised a spectacular show and waited in great anticipation. Suddenly, they heard the gallop of a horse and saw a man riding on horseback. "That's Philip Astley," the people in the crowd whispered to one another. Philip Astley, the man on horseback, took a deep breath as he raised one foot onto the horse's back. Slowly, he lifted himself up, standing with one foot on the saddle and the other on the horse's head. The crowd gasped. As Philip stood on the galloping horse, he pulled out his sword and held it above his head. The crowd applauded and cheered as they watched Philip's daring feat. They had never seen a man standing on top of a running horse, let alone a man on top of a running horse with a sword. How had he managed to do such a dangerous trick? But you see, Philip had figured something out. It turned out it was much easier to stand on a horse while it ran in a circle than in a straight line. Something called centrifugal force helped him stay on his feet. Philip rode around the circular track again and again so everyone in the audience could get a good look. This would be one of Philip Astley's first performances, but it certainly wouldn't be his last. News of his equestrian tricks spread far and wide, and soon, huge crowds of people gathered at his shows for a chance to be wowed. As his popularity grew, he hired more riders, musicians, and even a clown to make the performances more entertaining. Very soon, Astley's shows turned into something that many people recognize today, the modern circus. Philip Astley didn't come from a circus background. In fact, his father had been a cabinet maker, which was the profession Philip was supposed to go into. But Philip had always loved horses. When he was 17, he joined the cavalry unit of the British Army. This was the unit that rode on horseback. He did very well in the army, rising up to the rank of sergeant major. His time in the military proved just how talented he was when it came to training and riding horses. After Philip left the army, he started a riding school in England, where he began putting on performances to make some extra cash. It was at this riding school that people first saw Philip's trick riding and where he began his career in the circus. But it wasn't called the circus back then. That name would come later. Philip called his show and the stage Astley's Amphitheater. From here, hundreds of people could sit in the stands and watch Philip's mesmerizing show as he rode around the center ring. Philip's wife, Patty, joined him in his performances. She was also a talented rider and had her own set of tricks to dazzle the crowd. After seeing Philip Astley race around the ring, the crowd would wait for Patty to emerge. Moments later, she would gallop in on her horse, wearing what appeared to be a muff over her hands. As she got closer, the crowd soon realized it wasn't a piece of fabric covering her hands. It was a swarm of bees. Patty would continue to race around the track, with her hands and arms covered in bees. This performance, just like Philip's, became a great success. Soon, Philip moved his amphitheater to a new location near Westminster Bridge in London. Eager to drum up business, he dressed in his red military coat and rode through the city streets on his white horse. "Come one, come all!" he shouted. His shows were for anyone who could afford a ticket, and soon they attracted the notice of the nobility. Philip made sure that they got the best seats in the house. He even received a royal invitation. The King of England, George III, wanted to see Astley's thrilling performance. In 1772, his show traveled to Versailles, where he performed for King Louis XV of France. As you can see, things were going very well for Philip Astley. But in 1803, disaster struck. That year, his marvelous amphitheater caught on fire. In those days, there was no electricity, so the inside of his theater had to be lit with candles. And one day, these candles set the wooden building on fire. The flames destroyed much of the theater, its painted scenery, and props. Thankfully, Philip had earned so much money from show business that he was able to rebuild the amphitheater, and he built it bigger and better than ever before. In London, his show remained the talk of the town. Famous authors like Jane Austen and Charles Dickens wrote about Astley's amphitheater. "What a place it looked, that Astley's, with all the paint, gilding, and looking-glass." Inside, people caught the whiff of horses and fresh sawdust before the grand show began. After every act, another performer would appear from behind the huge curtain to dazzle the crowd. There were acrobats and tightrope walkers hanging dangerously in the air, and jugglers throwing and catching balls with incredible ease. Clowns jumped into the ring to make the crowd laugh, and sometimes there were even fireworks. "Everything was delightful, splendid, and surprising," Dickens wrote. Now, Philip didn't invent trick riding, acrobats, clowns, or tightrope walking. People had been doing these acts for years before he came along. He didn't even invent the word circus. The word actually comes from ancient Rome. In Latin, the language that ancient Romans spoke, circus means ring or circular line. You see, ancient Rome had chariot races and circular stadiums called circuses. You may have heard of a famous one called Circus Maximus. Just like circuses today, these ancient circuses had a ring at the center where people rode their horses. But there's one thing that Philip could claim as his own. He discovered the best size for the circus ring. For him, the ideal size was 42 feet across, and the size hasn't changed since the 1700s. Circuses still use a 42-foot ring today. Although Philip didn't invent all the acts, he was the first to bring them all together in one place. Inside his famous amphitheater, horse riders, acrobats, clowns, and musicians worked together to put on one of the greatest shows the crowds had ever seen. Philip was also the first to take his show on the road. The circus tent didn't exist yet, so he built wooden amphitheaters in the places he visited. People in Bristol, Dublin, and Paris enjoyed Astley's now famous circus. But this was just the beginning.
Hi friends, are you enjoying today's episode? I'd like to take a quick break from the story to tell you about another great place to learn about the past. Honest History creates magazines and books for kids that are filled with fun stories and activities that bring history to life. From pirates to spies to great inventions and so much more, you'll learn about interesting people, places, and events from around the world that made history. Created for kids ages 6 through 12, you can sign up and receive new adventures delivered straight to your doorstep every quarter. Just visit honesthistory.co. That's honesthistory.co to sign up today. Oh, and here's a special offer for our podcast listeners. Use code ANYTIMENOW for 10% off. Again, that special code is ANYTIMENOW. Okay, let's get back to the story.
Philip Astley, the father of the modern circus, would pass away in 1814 at the age of 72, but his show would live on for many more decades. Astley's amphitheater entertained London audiences for nearly 125 years, and by that time, the circus bug had spread far and wide. Hundreds of circuses popped up across Britain and the United States. And there was one invention that made this possible: the railroad. As more and more railways were built across Britain and America, people could travel faster and further than ever before. A train got to a new place within days, when before it had taken weeks. Circuses loaded all their equipment onto rail cars and set out for a new town every few days. And everyone knew exactly when the circus arrived. How, you ask? Because there was a huge parade. Crowds of people would gather in town and they'd watch a band march down the street. Followed by gilded carriages and dozens of horses, there would be people dressed in sparkling costumes and maybe even animals like elephants or camels. In the United States, many of these towns were small and didn't have many large buildings for such a grand show. So, one American businessman came up with an idea. His name was Joshua Purdy, and he decided to use a large tent for his circus building. The clever idea was quickly snapped up by many other circuses. This tent was known as the Big Top, and when people saw it, they knew the circus was still in town. But life in the circus wasn't easy. In fact, it was incredibly dangerous. Tightrope walkers, lion tamers, and trapeze artists put their lives on the line every night. There was even one dangerous act called the human cannonball, where a person was shot out of a cannon. The very first person to do this was a girl named Rosa Matilda Richter, but everyone knew her by her stage name, Zazelle. She was just 14 years old when she made history for her death-defying trick. Her very first show was in 1877 inside a building in London called the Royal Aquarium. You can just imagine the scene. That evening, crowds of people filled the inside of the beautiful auditorium. They had been told that a girl would be shot from a cannon, and they had to see it to believe it. An announcer arrived on the stage to speak to the audience. "Ladies and gentlemen," he shouted, "without further ado, I present to you the one, the only, human cannonball, Zazelle!" The crowd looked up at the huge cannon that sat on the balcony of the auditorium. Within moments, they heard a thunderous bang and saw fire explode out of the giant gun. Smoke billowed as a figure shot 20 feet across the room, flying over the crowd. The figure landed in a net, safely got to her feet, and bowed. The crowd cheered and waved their hats in the air. Of course, Zazelle hadn't actually been shot out of the cannon with gunpowder. Instead, she was launched into the air using a large spring. But the performers added smoke and fire to make it look like a real explosion. Zazelle would be the first person to achieve this daring act, and her fame would spread far and wide. She would even travel to the United States and perform the human cannonball with the famous Barnum and Bailey circus. Zazelle would have an accident many years later, but thankfully, she survived all her dangerous stunts. Many other performers, however, weren't so lucky. Today, you can find cemeteries across the U.S. dedicated to circus performers who lost their lives on the job. So life in the circus was dangerous, but it was also incredibly hard work. Many performers would travel around the country for months and sometimes even sail across the ocean to go to Europe or the United States. And the circus was made up of more than just the performers. Teams of carpenters would have to build new pens for horses, and young workers carried endless buckets of water to the animals. Even elephants were put to work, dragging the circus tent into place, and laborers hammered the stake into the ground to stop the giant tent from blowing away. And every few days, all these workers and performers would pack up and move to the next town where they would set it all up again. By the 20th century, the circus began to lose its popularity. Some of the performances were seen as cruel, and people were concerned for the welfare of the circus workers. People were also worried about the animals. Life on the road was incredibly difficult for the horses, lions, elephants, zebras, and camels that made the circus famous. The circus had to change if it wanted to survive, and change it did. Although it's not as popular as it once was, the circus still exists. You can see it with grand shows like Cirque du Soleil, where they still use Philip Astley's 42-foot circus ring. You won't see any animals at this show, so you can rest assured no animals were harmed. When you watch these dazzling performances with talented acrobats and jaw-dropping stunts, it's hard to imagine that it all began over 250 years ago. One spring day in 1768, Philip Astley stood up on his horse as it galloped around a ring, and the rest, they say, was history.
Welcome back! What did you think of today's adventure? We hope you learned something new. Be sure to share the story with your friends and family, and use what you've learned today to go out there and make a positive impact on history yourself. That's all for now, but if you want to learn more about important and amazing stories from the past, be sure to subscribe to Honest History Magazine, where you'll discover stories from around the world. Thanks for listening! This episode was narrated by Randall Lawrence and written by Heidi Coburn. Production was led by Robot Pirate Media. To learn more about Honest History, visit us at honesthistory.co and follow along for updates on social media.